Chapter 1. It was the kind of afternoon that made St. Millicent's look like a painting come to life. The June sun glinted off polished hedgerows and tea-trays. The air was rich with roses and elderflower, cordial, and the laughter of neatly dressed villagers floated across the lawn of Gossington Manor. The annual garden fête, hosted as ever by the Honourable Horace Delaford, was a staple of village life. There were ribboned fruitcakes to be judged, awkward violin recitals from local school children, and a raffle prize rumoured to be a crate of French wine hidden in Horace's cellar since the war. To most, it was a scene of harmless tradition, but Miss Marple, seated with a modest paper plate of shortbread and her knitting bag resting at her feet, sensed something less innocent in the air. There was too much smiling, too much cordiality, and for a village that had recently lost its vicar, there was a curious lack of mourning in the talk. "Did you notice," Miss Marple murmured to herself, eyes narrowing ever so slightly behind her spectacles, "how no one mentioned poor Reverend Lyle until his widow arrived? Indeed, Mrs. Lyle had entered late, unfashionably so, her black veil askew, and her eyes ringed with the dullness of grief. The widow sat apart, offered tea, but little conversation. Few spoke to her for more than a passing phrase of sympathy, yet Miss Marple watched carefully as people glanced her way, avoiding eye contact or whispering as they passed. From across the lawn, a sudden burst of clapping arose. Young Jasper Delaford had finished his piano piece, a stumbling rendition of Chopin that earned him both applause and a withering look from his stepmother, Celia. Miss Marple tilted her head. Celia Delaford, beautiful, sharp-tongued, and always a touch overdressed for a village affair. She was whispering now to Lady Dalrymple, with one gloved hand covering her mouth. Her husband, Horace, was further off, polishing a silver tray with a cloth heat evidently filched from the kitchen staff. "I suppose it's tradition now," said a voice beside Miss Marple. She turned. It was Inspector Colin Brannigan, sipping warm lemonade and squinting into the sun. "The garden fête," she said lightly. "The Delafords. Always something curious around them," Brannigan muttered. "Can't put my finger on it. It's just," Marple smiled. "And yet you're here." "Just in case," he said. Then, after a pause, "You see that fellow near the orchard wall? Alfred Sims, groundskeeper here for 30 years. Stared down 4 burglars with a rake once, but today he's jumpy as a kitten." Miss Marple followed his gaze. Alfred stood by the gate that led out to the village lane. He kept glancing toward it, waiting for someone. The bell rang. A soft ceremonial chime. Lady Dalrymple was announcing the cake judging. The crowd shuffled toward the long tables. Miss Marple remained seated, half knitting, half watching. Through the leaves above, a single blackbird sang, a melancholy note in the cheer. Then it came. A scream, not the sharp panic of drama, but the cracking edge of genuine horror. It came from the gate. Alfred Sims was running, stumbling toward the crowd. His hands were out, his mouth moving without sound. Behind him, the gate creaked open on its hinges, and just beyond it, half hidden by the garden wall, lay a body. Chapter 2. The laughter died all at once. Guests froze mid-step, plates tilted in, forgotten hands, and the chatter turned to whispers that fractured like brittle porcelain. Horace Delaford was the first to speak. voice raised but brittle. "Someone fetch a doctor." Or, "Brannigan, you're here. Good heavens, man, do something." Inspector Brannigan was already moving, brushing past Alfred Sims, whose breath came in gasps. The old groundskeeper leaned against the manor wall, one shaking hand pressed to his chest, his cap fallen in the grass. Miss Marple stood too, not with panic, but a composed urgency. Her knitting bag swung from one arm as she followed Brannigan through the thinning crowd. Behind her, Lady Dalrymple was fanning herself furiously with a folded programme. The gate stood open now, crooked on its hinges. Beyond it lay the gravel path to the main village lane. But the body had fallen just within. Feet angled toward the road, head turned awkwardly to the side. Miss Marple saw at once that the man was unfamiliar. He was perhaps 50, stout but not unkempt, dressed in a brown three-piece suit with a paisley tie. His shoes were city shoes, polished but not suited for village gravel. A leather satchel lay open at his side, its contents spilled. A pocketbook, a crumpled receipt, a silver fountain pen, and a visiting card. Brannigan stooped to pick it up, squinting. "Jonathan Palgrave," he read aloud. "Chartered accountant, Paddington." Horace Delaford's voice cracked from behind. "Never heard of him." Celia Delaford now stood beside her husband, a silk scarf gathered at her throat. Her eyes, shadowed by long lashes, narrowed slightly. "Is he dead?" she asked, with the detached tone of someone asking about a roast left in the oven too long. Brannigan knelt and checked the man's pulse. Miss Marple was already observing something else. A faint purplish hue at the edge of the lips, the unnatural slackness of the fingers. "He is," Brannigan confirmed softly. "No wound, no blood." He turned. "Miss Marple?" "I'm no physician," she said modestly, stepping closer, "but I dare say the signs are familiar. I saw such a case once in St. Mary Mead. Foxglove poisoning, if I recall. Heart simply stopped." Brannigan's brow furrowed. "Poison? Perhaps," she murmured, "or something mimicking it." Alfred Sims had regained his voice, hoarse but audible. "He just fell, sir. I swear it. I opened the gate, and he collapsed right there. Didn't even say a word." "Did you know him?" Brannigan asked. The groundskeeper shook his head. "Never seen him before. Came walking up from the road, like any other stranger. Thought maybe he was here for the fete." Horace was dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. "This is a disaster, a complete disaster, on my lawn. Good God, the press will have a field day." Miss Marple, meanwhile, crouched to study the satchel. The items had been packed in an orderly fashion. The receipt, now fluttering against the grass, bore the name of a local inn, the Bell and Lantern, dated that morning. "Someone will need to fetch the landlord," she said quietly. "If Mr. Palgrave was staying there, he may have left a record, or perhaps a conversation." Brannigan rose. "I'll see to it. In the meantime, Horace, see that no one leaves." Horace bristled. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect I need answers before everyone runs home to rewrite their memories," Brannigan said curtly. "It's best." The inspector gestured to a constable who'd appeared from the manor's west side. The man nodded and headed down the lane at a jog. Miss Marple turned to Brannigan once more. "Did you notice his shoes?" He frowned. "Shined? City type?" "And no dust on them." as if he'd only just arrived, and by car. Yet he walked up the lane. Brannigan considered this. You think someone dropped him off nearby? Or somewhere he did not intend to stay long, she replied. They heard another stir behind them. Lady Dalrymple had fainted or nearly. Her companion, Mrs. Henshaw, was pressing smelling salts to her nose with theatrical concern. More guests were dispersing, murmuring, glancing back with unease. Then Celia Delaford approached. Her expression was composed, perhaps too much so. I assume the fete is cancelled. No one's moving until I speak with them, Brannigan said. Then do get on with it, she replied coolly. The villagers are like hens when frightened. If you don't contain them, the gossip will spread faster than the poison. She walked away before Brannigan could respond. Miss Marple watched her go, then murmured, Such an elegant woman, but dreadfully careless with her opinions. Brannigan exhaled. I'll need to start interviews in the drawing room. Could you? He didn't finish the sentence. I'll be in the garden, Miss Marple said softly, listening. Sometimes the breeze brings more than the police can. Brannigan offered her a tight nod and turned to the constable. Secure the gate, and keep an eye on that satchel. As the sun dipped a little lower, and the fete dissolved into disorder, Miss Marple returned to her seat beside the rhododendrons. Not to knit, but to watch and listen. Someone in the crowd knew why a stranger had died at the manor gate, and she intended to find out who. Chapter 3. Inside the manor's drawing room, the lace curtains had been drawn to temper the afternoon sun. Though the heat still clung to the walls like a nervous hush, the scent of overbrewed tea and lilies from the centrepiece mixed unpleasantly in the air. Inspector Brannigan stood near the fireplace, a leather notebook in hand. Chairs had been rearranged into a loose semicircle. Where select guests from, the fete now sat uneasily, like schoolchildren awaiting reprimand. Horace Delaford paced near the drinks cabinet, pouring himself a modest whisky he would later pretend not to have needed. Celia had refused to join the drawing-room inquiry. She claimed a headache and vanished upstairs. Mrs. Henshaw, by contrast, remained, smoothing her skirt every 30 seconds with trembling fingers. Brannigan cleared his throat. Before I begin formal statements, I'll ask plainly, did anyone here recognize the deceased, Jonathan Palgrave, an accountant from Paddington? A silence. Not the confused sort, but the kind that suggests careful inner calculations. Finally, Lady Dalrymple, her colour returning, spoke faintly. I've never heard the name, nor seen the man. Brannigan nodded, unconvinced. He turned to Alfred Sims, now seated with a warm towel and a sherry at his side. You said the man walked up to the gate on his own? Alfred gave a raspy nod. From the lane. I was adjusting the bolt from inside. He got as far as the stones, looked up at me, and then just dropped. You didn't hear a car? No, sir. Not so much as a bicycle. Brannigan made a note. Miss Marple was not in the drawing-room. She had declined the invitation with a pleasant smile, and a promise that she was far better suited to listening in the rose garden than interrogating indoors. Brannigan, to his credit, hadn't objected, but what Miss Marple had done was position herself at the open terrace doorway, knitting idle rows, while the voices inside floated outward. She's clever, whispered young Lucy Henshaw, standing beside her mother near the piano. Miss Marple smiled softly. "Observation is often the best tool for the curious, my dear. Do you enjoy mysteries?" Lucy nodded. "But I never guessed the ending right." "That's half the pleasure," Miss Marple said, eyes still on the doorway. Inside, the conversation had shifted. What business would an accountant have in St. Millicent's? Brannigan asked aloud. "None, I'd wager," said Horace, taking another sip. "We're a quaint parish, not the sort to attract financiers from London." "But he stayed at the Bell and Lantern," Brannigan reminded them. "The landlord, Mr. Fossey, confirms he arrived last night, took a single room, and made inquiries about local properties, asking after the manor in particular." That drew attention. Even Horace stopped drinking. "The manor," echoed Mrs. Henshaw, startled. "Fossey says Mr. Palgrave had a list," Brannigan continued. "He also mentioned asking about the late Reverend Lyle." This produced a visible reaction. Mrs. Henshaw's lips parted, but no words came. Brannigan caught it. "Yes?" She glanced quickly toward Lady Dalrymple, who looked away. "It's only—" Well, the vicarage stood empty since Reverend Lyle's accident. People assumed it would be reassigned. The idea of someone buying it— She trailed off. Brannigan narrowed his eyes. And yet the innkeeper said Mr. Palgrave didn't ask about the vicarage, only about Reverend Lyle, not the property. Another silence. "Forgive me," Lady Dalrymple interjected with forced poise. "But is it entirely wise to speculate without cause? The poor man could have had a weak heart. City men often do." Brannigan said nothing for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said eventually, "though I've asked the coroner to expedite an examination." He closed his notebook. "That will be all for now. Please don't leave the estate until I've spoken with everyone individually." Guests began filing out. Lucy lingered by Miss Marple. "Do you think the man was murdered?" she asked in a whisper. Miss Marple's hands never stopped moving. "I think, dear, that people rarely fall down dead in gardens without reason. And reasons, I've found, are often people-shaped." From the staircase, a faint sound, footsteps retreating. Celia Delaford. She had come halfway down during the questioning pause just out of sight, and now was vanishing again with deliberate grace. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the upper landing. Back inside, Brannigan remained. As he reached the sideboard to retrieve his hat, he noticed a small scuff mark on the floorboards, just beside the satchel, where it had been laid down earlier. A muddy smear, almost missed in the soft lighting. He crouched, touched it lightly. "Not from a boot," he muttered. "Looks more like—" But the sentence drifted off. Across the garden, Miss Marple folded her knitting. Her gaze was no longer on the drawing-room. It was on the distant lane where someone, dressed in grey, stood still beneath the shadow of an elm tree, watching the manor. And when Miss Marple blinked, the figure was gone. Chapter 4. By the time Miss Marple reached the spot where she had seen the grey figure, there was only the wind. It stirred the branches of the old elm gently, but no footprints remained on the compacted earth beneath. She did not call out. That would have been theatrical. Instead, she knelt by the grass, gloved fingers brushing the soil. A disturbance, yes, a patch where moss had been scuffed, and the faint trace of tobacco ash. She sniffed lightly. Pipe tobacco. Darker, heavier than the usual village blend. Not English, she thought. Balkan? A curious choice for someone hiding in shadows. Behind her, a voice cleared. Looking for something, Miss Marple? She straightened slowly. Brannigan approached from the lane, hat in hand, only confirming I saw someone standing here. She said, "A man, I believe, watching the manor." Brannigan's brow furrowed. Before or after the questioning? During, while the others were still in the drawing-room. He glanced toward the manor. "You're certain?" "I've found my eyesight generally reliable," she said mildly. "Even now." Brannigan gave a short nod, then crouched, scanning the base of the elm. He found what she had already seen, the disturbed moss, the ash. He rubbed some between his fingertips. "Not village tobacco." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "and not accidental." They stood together in silence for a moment, before Brannigan added, "I've just come from speaking with Mr. Fossey at the inn. He's shaken, but helpful. And Mr. Palgrave's room. Tidy. No luggage, just a briefcase. Inside, business cards, an appointment journal, and 2 pages torn from a church register." Miss Marple's head tilted. "That's rather specific." "Baptism records," Brannigan said. "One name circled. Samuel Lyle, 1892. Our late Reverend's father, apparently." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Brannigan continued. "There was a 3rd page missing. Only the corner remained, torn at an angle. A curious souvenir," Miss Marple murmured. "And not one most accountants would carry." Brannigan nodded grimly. "I think Mr. Palgrave wasn't here on business. Not ordinary business, anyway." They began walking back together toward the manor. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. Brannigan said quietly, "Tell me something, Miss Marple. When Reverend Lyle died, did anything strike you as odd?" She didn't answer at once. Her eyes flicked across the hedgerows. Her voice measured when it came. "I always found Reverend Lyle's sermons heavy with righteousness but light on mercy. His accident, falling from the study window, was ruled a tragic misstep. And yet," she hesitated, "I've never known a man so careful with books to be careless with footing." Brannigan glanced at her sidelong. "You think he was pushed?" I think people can fall in more ways than one," she replied, "and not always from great height." They reached the gate again. Alfred Sims stood nearby, this time with a blanket over his shoulders and a sturdy-looking walking stick gripped tightly. When he saw Miss Marple, he shuffled closer. "I remembered something," he said hoarsely. She leaned in. "Yes, Alfred?" When the man collapsed, Mr. Palgrave, he looked surprised. I mean, really surprised. Not like someone who knew he was unwell. "You're saying he wasn't in distress until that moment?" Brannigan asked. Alfred nodded. "He looked fine coming up the road. A bit hurried maybe, but when he saw me, he stopped like he was going to say something. Then he made a motion with his hand, dropped, dead before he hit the stones." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Brannigan. "And you're quite sure there was no one behind him?" she asked gently. "Not a soul," Alfred whispered. "He came alone." Brannigan nodded. "Thank you, Alfred. That's helpful." The old man retreated to his bench. Brannigan sighed. If he wasn't poisoned earlier, then whatever killed him happened just before he collapsed, which means someone had to be close by. Or, Miss Marple said, he was responding to something, a message perhaps, or a threat. Not all poisons act slowly. Brannigan looked toward the satchel, which still lay cordoned off under a linen cloth. And if it wasn't poison at all, then perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, it was fear. Brannigan blinked. Fear? Some men are terrified of something far more than pain, she said. Exposure, secrets, the past. A breeze stirred again, and from the far side of the hedge came the sound of a door closing. The manor was beginning to settle, the fate long forgotten. As Miss Marple returned to her seat near the rose trellis, she passed Lucy Henshaw, who was now whispering to a garden boy. The boy looked pale, too pale for someone who hadn't spoken all afternoon. She made a mental note. When she sat again, the needles did not resume. Instead, her hands rested, folded. The sun had begun to lower behind the steeple, and somewhere beneath its shadow a secret had stirred. Chapter 5. Twilight stretched slowly across the village, the golden haze giving way to long shadows and a cooler breeze. Gossington Manor's guests had thinned by then. Most escorted to the front garden with apologies, murmured platitudes, and a few veiled warnings not to speak with the press. But Miss Marple remained. She sat on the wooden bench beneath the rose trellis, where the air smelled faintly of lilac and scorched pastry. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. Instead, she observed the boy from earlier. The one Lucy Henshaw had whispered to. He was now pushing a wheelbarrow awkwardly toward the rear stables. A button gleamed on his cuff. Silver. Unusual for stable wear. She stood. By the time she reached him, he was emptying straw into the compost pit behind the tool shed. He hadn't noticed her. His face was pale, his shirt collar too loose. "Good evening," she said gently. The boy jumped, nearly tipping the barrow. "Sorry, ma'am," he stammered. "Didn't see you there." "That's quite all right," Miss Marple replied. "I've been known to vanish in plain sight." He tried to smile, failing. "Forgive me," she added. "You're James, aren't you? The Delafoods' new garden boy?" He nodded. "Started last month, only part-time." She glanced at the button again. It shimmered subtly in the fading light. "That's a smart button for a working shirt," she observed casually. James looked down at it, then flushed. "Oh, yes, ma'am. It's from one of Mr. Horace's old jackets. The housekeeper said I could use the shirt. I didn't realize. No judgment, dear, merely an observation. Silver always catches the eye." He relaxed a fraction. Miss Marple's voice softened. "I saw you speaking to Miss Lucy earlier." His posture tensed again. "She said you looked frightened. Was she mistaken?" James hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, "I saw someone." Miss Marple remained still. "Where?" James glanced back toward the elm. "Just past the gate, before the scream. I was raking behind the orchard, and I saw a man step out of a car. He didn't walk to the fete like the others. He waited by the tree, smoked, then walked down toward the manor. A man with a satchel." James shook his head. "No, the one with the satchel came after. He walked up from the lane, but the man I saw, He got out of a black car, drove off after he lit his pipe. Miss Marple absorbed this silently. Wummed, you see the driver? No, ma'am. Windows were tinted. But the man who stepped out, he was wearing gloves. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Thank you, James, she said warmly. That was very brave. He gave a shaky nod, then returned to his barrow. As Miss Marple turned back toward the house, her thoughts raced faster than her steps. A man waiting near the gate, a city visitor collapsing minutes later, tobacco ash beneath the elm, a second car no one had mentioned. She found Brannigan in the parlour, now dimly lit with gas lamps. He stood over the desk, reviewing Palgrave's appointment journal. We have something, she said simply. Brannigan looked up. She relayed James's account, each detail precise. He exhaled. So Palgrave wasn't alone when he arrived. Someone waited for him. Or in short, he reached the gate without company, she said. Brannigan's brow furrowed. What about motive? Why would someone want him dead before he reached the house? Miss Marple's fingers grazed the corner of a letter on the desk, because perhaps of what he intended to say. Brannigan blinked. You think he came to confront someone? I think, she said slowly, he came with knowledge, and someone feared what that knowledge might become, once shared. Brannigan opened the drawer and retrieved the briefcase again. I forgot to mention, there was also this. He handed her a slip of card, folded, creased. Inside was a hand-drawn map, simple but precise, a marked route from Paddington Station to St. Millicent's churchyard. Circled at the bottom, Delaford Vault. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Was Mr. Palgrave looking for a grave? She murmured. Brannigan was already flipping through the baptism register. You mentioned Lyle's father, she added. Samuel? Yes, but there's no death record here, Brannigan said, and no burial under the church's registry for Samuel Lyle. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Then perhaps that's what Mr. Palgrave hoped to uncover or confirm. The night had fully fallen now. A single light burned in the upper window, Celia Delaford's room. Miss Marple's gaze lingered there, unreadable. She turned back to Brannigan. Tomorrow, she said quietly, we should visit the Delaford Vault. Brannigan arched a brow. You think we'll find something? She picked up her knitting from the desk, a smile faint and dry. Inspector, in villages like ours, it's rarely what you find that solves a murder. It's what was buried, and who made sure it stayed that way. Chapter 6. The churchyard of St. Millicent's was quiet in the pale morning mist, the headstones rising like crooked teeth through low-lying fog. Crows had stirred early from the oaks, and their cries echoed as Miss Marple and Inspector Brannigan approached the old Delaford Vault, a structure half swallowed by ivy and time. Brannigan jangled a ring of iron keys, recently retrieved from the parish warden. He squinted at the engraving above the sealed arch. Delaford family, Essen, 1793. A grand legacy, he muttered, fitting the heaviest key into the rusted lock. Would be a shame if it ended in scandal. Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes moved not over the vault itself, but over the disturbed ivy trailing away from the path. Someone had come here recently, perhaps more than once. The door groaned open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old decay. Brannigan struck a match, then lit the small lantern he brought. The flame flickered against rows of stone niches, each one inscribed with a name. Beatrice Delaford, 1911, 1954. Thomas Delaford, 1867, 1933. Brannigan lifted the lantern towards the far wall. There, near the floor, a plaque read, Reverend Samuel Lyle, 1892. Miss Marple stepped forward. No death date, she murmured. Brannigan lowered the lantern. Could be an unclaimed memorial, or a lie. The floor beneath the plaque showed signs of disturbance. A faint crescent of earth outlined the stone base, as if someone had recently pried or tampered with it. Brannigan knelt, brushing the loose soil with his hand. No mortar, he said. This lifts. With effort, they shifted the stone aside, revealing a hollow cavity beneath. Empty. No coffin, no remains. Just a dry, narrow chamber, and curiously, a broken brass clasp bolted to the inner wall, as if something had once been secured there. Brannigan stood. So, Samuel Lyle never made it here. Samuel Lyle never made it here. Miss Marple turned slowly, or someone made certain he seemed to have. They replaced the stone carefully. Brannigan blew out the lantern. As they emerged, Miss Marple paused at a headstone, partially hidden behind the vault. It was older, the carving nearly worn away by rain. Josephine Cartwright, she read aloud. Died 1919. No family name added. Brannigan joined her. Cartwright? Wasn't that the name of the physician who signed Reverend Lyle's death certificate? Dr. Edwin Cartwright, she nodded. His daughter, perhaps. And no birth year, Brannigan added. That's odd. Miss Marple traced a finger over the worn inscription. Or convenient. You know, Inspector, it's a curious thing how some graves tell us too much, and others far too little. They made their way back to the village. As they walked, Miss Marple's mind returned not to the grave, but to Celia Delaford. The sharp restraint in her voice, her cool avoidance of the questioning, the absence of surprise when Palgrave collapsed. She recalled the old rhyme her mother used to say, "Beware the calmest woman in the room. Her silence is never empty." Back at the manor, Celia was already on the veranda, a silver teapot untouched beside her. She wore a tailored green suit, far too elegant for breakfast. "You're both up early," she called with a faint smile. "Grave hunting so soon after breakfast, Inspector?" Brannigan stopped at the foot of the steps. "Did Mr. Palgrave ever contact you, Mrs. Delaford?" Celia raised an eyebrow. "Not directly, though now I wonder if he should have. I do enjoy solving puzzles." Miss Marple stepped forward, folding her gloves neatly. "Puzzles can be dangerous, dear, especially when one doesn't know which pieces have been hidden." Celia met her gaze unblinking. "And yet you play, Miss Marple." A pause. Brannigan cleared his throat. "We found an empty vault bearing Reverend Lyle's father's name." Celia's smile didn't waver. How dramatic. "No records of burial, no confirmation of death, only a plaque." "Well," she said, brushing a leaf from the table, "perhaps the Reverend preferred ghosts to relatives." Brannigan watched her carefully. "Mr. Palgrave came here asking about Reverend Lyle. He brought baptismal records, and he died moments before reaching the house. You can't seriously think I had anything to do with it?" "No, Mrs. Delaford. I'm simply noting the pattern." She rose then. perfectly composed. "Do let me know when you find the missing piece, Inspector. I'd be quite interested in what you believe it means." With that, she returned inside. Miss Marple said quietly, "You noticed she didn't ask what happened at the vault?" Brannigan nodded, because she already knew. They turned back toward the path. As they reached the gate, a small figure ran to meet them, Lucy Henshaw. She clutched something in her hand, breathless. "Miss Marple, I found this. It was a torn corner of thick parchment. Old, edged with water damage. Faint ink marked the corner, Lyle, 1889, written in looping cursive." Miss Marple took it delicately. "Where did you find this, dear?" "In the library, under the cushion. I was hiding there yesterday. I didn't tell anyone." Brannigan took a sharp breath. "The missing third page," he said. Miss Marple smiled at Lucy. "You've done something very important today." As the girl ran back toward the garden, Miss Marple held the fragment in the morning light. Lyle, 1889, 2 years before Samuel Lyle's baptism. A clue, perhaps, but to what? She turned to Brannigan. "Inspector, I think it's time we asked Mrs. Lyle a few questions. Before someone else decides, silence is more convenient than truth." Chapter 7. Reverend Lyle's cottage stood at the edge of the village, separated from the church by a narrow stream and a hedge of yew that looked more like a line of mourning than foliage. The house had the quiet stillness of a place abandoned by time, curtains drawn, chimneys cold. Mrs. Lyle answered the door in a shawl and heavy skirt, her face pale, drawn, yet oddly alert. Grief still clung to her voice, but behind her dark eyes something lived, something long repressed. "Miss Marple," she said flatly, "and Inspector, you'd better come in." The sitting room smelled of lavender polish and stale air. Nothing had changed since the Reverend's passing. Not a book moved, not a photograph touched. The vicar's chair remained by the hearth, a tea-ring still faintly visible on the side table beside it. Miss Marple sat gently. Brannigan remained standing. "We understand this is difficult, Mrs. Lyle," he began. "But a man named Jonathan Palgrave came to St. Millicent's asking questions about your late husband. Yesterday he died at the manor gate." She said nothing. "He had in his possession baptism records," Brannigan continued, "including your husband's father, Samuel Lyle. And he had a note referencing a vault in the churchyard." Still silence. Miss Marple spoke, her tone softer. "There was also a torn document found just today, bearing the name Lyle, 1889. A date that precedes the official baptism we have for Samuel." Mrs. Lyle's eyes flinched, just once. Then she stood, walked slowly to a cabinet by the piano, and unlocked the top drawer. From it she drew a folded letter. Yellowed, trembling, she handed it to Miss Marple. "I never meant to keep it," she said quietly, "but I couldn't destroy it either." Brannigan leaned in as Miss Marple unfolded the page. The handwriting was erratic, slanted, a desperate script. "I cannot hold this any longer. The boy is not mine. He was born in shame, taken from someone who never consented. I did what I thought was merciful, baptized him myself, raised him like a son. But I lied to God. And now I fear the truth will find me. If it does, let it find me forgiven. El. Brannigan repeated, Edwin Lyle." Miss Marple's face remained composed, but her voice lowered. "So Reverend Lyle was not Samuel's biological son?" Mrs. Lyle nodded once. "He suspected, for years, that his own father had taken someone. A servant girl, perhaps. Someone no one ever spoke of again. The letter came to us 2 months before the Reverend's death. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return address." Brannigan stepped back. "You never came forward. What would you have had me do, Inspector? Tarnish a man's memory? Destroy what was left of his dignity after his fall? What was left of his dignity after his fall?" Miss Marple interjected softly. "What if Jonathan Palgrave came to confirm that very truth, and someone couldn't bear for it to be known?" Mrs. Lyle stared into the fireplace. "I don't know who he was, but my husband believed, toward the end, that he'd been watched. He said someone had returned, someone who knew." Brannigan turned to Miss Marple. "The letter explains motive, shame, inheritance, reputation, but not method," Miss Marple replied. "How did Jonathan Palgrave die so quickly, so suddenly, in front of witnesses and without direct contact?" Brannigan exhaled. "Fear? Panic?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Not fear alone. He was fit enough to travel, to ask questions. No history of heart trouble." She turned to Mrs. Lyle. "Did your husband have enemies?" The widow gave a small, bitter laugh. "He had parishioners. That's nearly the same." Then a pause. "There was one man," she said after a moment. "Years ago. He left the village suddenly, after an argument. I don't know the details, but Edwin, my husband, said he'd threatened to dig up the past. I always thought it was a figure of speech." "Name?" Brannigan asked. "I only remember the last," she murmured. "Cartwright." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Not Dr. Cartwright? No, a younger man, perhaps a relation." Brannigan stepped away, already flipping open his notebook, but Miss Marple stayed seated. Her voice dropped, intimate. "One last question, Mrs. Lyle. When your husband fell, did you see it happen?" A long silence. Then, "I heard it. I was in the garden. He was alone in the study." "Was the window open?" She nodded. "He kept it open for air, but—" Marple offered a kind smile. "Thank you. You've been brave." They left the cottage soon after. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. A milk cart passed, and children's voices echoed faintly across the stream. Brannigan walked briskly beside her. So the Reverend wasn't who he claimed to be, and someone, Cartwright possibly, wanted the truth unearthed. And Palgrave may have gotten too close. Brannigan looked grim. "We need to find this Cartwright." Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Her thoughts had turned inward, toward that broken vault clasp, the missing page, the false name etched in stone. The Delafords, the Cartwrights, the servants no one remembered. "At last," she said, "we will, but I think someone's trying very hard to ensure we don't, and I fear another mistake will not be permitted." Chapter 8. The village records office stood modestly behind the parish library, a narrow brick building that smelled of dust and vinegar polish. Its filing system hadn't changed since 1910, and its keeper, Mr. Lionel Fetch, hadn't changed since 1950. Brannigan was not a man built for patience, but Miss Marple insisted they begin here. Old secrets tend to settle in the dust, she said, scanning a cabinet labeled Census, 1880s to 1910. It's where people forget to look. Mr. Fetch, wearing a waistcoat 2 sizes too large and spectacles fogged with condensation, shuffled into the back room to fetch more municipal indexes. Brannigan, meanwhile, leaned over the main ledger. "Cartwright, Cartwright," he muttered. Miss Marple was flipping delicately through an old baptismal register when her finger paused. "I may have something." Brannigan looked up. She turned the book toward him. "Here, 1891. Baptism of Edwin Cartwright, son of Josephine Cartwright. No, father listed." Brannigan blinked. "Josephine Cartwright, the headstone behind the Delaford vault." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She died in 1919, unmarried. Her child baptized, but with no paternal claim." "And the Reverend at the time, Samuel Lyle," Brannigan added, "the man who may have fathered Edwin." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, which would make Reverend Lyle and Edwin Cartwright half-brothers. Brannigan stood straight, and Jonathan Palgrave found out. If Edwin Cartwright's son or grandson is alive today, he might have a claim to the Delaford estate, especially if there's no direct heir left in the Lyle line. Miss Marple's brows furrowed. The question, then, is not just who killed Palgrave, but who knew what he knew. Before Brannigan could respond, Mr. Fetch returned with a small cloth-bound ledger. "Old property deeds," he wheezed. "Late Victorian and Edwardian leases." Miss Marple thumbed through the faded pages until she paused again. "A deed signed in 1892, she said. "Samuel Lyle granted tenancy of a cottage. Address matches what is now the vicarage. But look at the countersignature." Brannigan leaned in. "Horace Delaford." Miss Marple closed the book. "So the Delafords have had a hand in every transaction, every transfer of property linked to the Lyles since the beginning." Brannigan stepped back, "which puts Horace on the board." Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Horace is nervous, yes, but not calculating. He cares more about how his cocktail napkins are folded than ancestral skeletons. If someone is playing the long game, they're not doing it for appearances." Brannigan's eyes darkened. "Celia." Miss Marple was already heading for the door. "Let's have a look at that silver button." Back at Gossington Manor, the garden was unnervingly still. James, the garden boy, was nowhere in sight. The kitchen maid reported having seen him leave in a hurry an hour earlier, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Miss Marple and Brannigan went straight to the stables. Inside the tack room, hanging neatly on a peg, was the working jacket James had worn. The silver button, distinctive, polished, and clearly not part of standard servant attire, was missing. Brannigan checked the drawers, overturned a small crate of gardening tools, and then paused at a dusty trunk in the corner. Inside was a stack of folded clothes, a shoe-polish tin, and, beneath a cloth, a small box of old photographs. Miss Marple lifted the top image, a group photo, black and white, edges curled. 4 figures stood outside the church gate. One was unmistakably Horace Delaford. Another was a woman, Celia, though visibly younger, and between them stood a boy, 12 or 13, mismatched trousers, hands shoved in his pockets, narrow face, eyes lowered. Brannigan took the photo. "Back row," he muttered. "That boy!" Miss Marple whispered. "Oh," he muttered. "That boy!" Miss Marple whispered. "James." "No, that's too old a photo. But look at the face." Brannigan pulled another image from the box. This one clearer, dated 1969. The same boy, now grown, suited, unsmiling, standing beside a gravestone. "Edwin Cartwright," Brannigan said. "It has to be. That's the son. And the man Lucy Henshaw says her mother met once, on the train, with bad teeth and shiny shoes." Miss Marple's face clouded. "Then James is not who he claims to be." Brannigan looked grim. "And if he's Edwin's son, that makes him the last remaining blood heir to Samuel Zile." They turned abruptly as a door slammed upstairs. Footsteps. Brannigan dashed into the hall, drawing his coat aside to free his holster. But Miss Marple paused. On the floor by the stairwell, barely visible beneath the radiator pipe, was something glinting in the light. She bent and retrieved it. A matchbox. Not the usual kind. A rare brand, imported, the same kind that had left ash beneath the elm tree. Miss Marple's hand closed around it. She turned toward the stairs, her voice low but firm. "Inspector, the man who watched Palgrave die. He never left the manor." Chapter 9. The stairwell creaked as Brannigan took the steps two at a time, his shadow flickering along the banister in the dimming light. Miss Marple followed more slowly, eyes scanning each painting and polished curve of the railing, as if the house itself might confess its secrets. At the landing, a corridor split off toward the east wing. Unused guest rooms, Celia Delaford's suite, and the locked study that once belonged to Horace's father. A faint click. Brannigan froze, hand on his holster. The door at the end of the corridor swung half open. Inside, lamplight flickered. Then James stepped out. But it wasn't the same James they'd seen earlier that week. His work shirt was gone. He now wore a grey suit jacket, too large in the shoulders but freshly pressed, the collar stiff and pinned to it, not a silver button, but a signet brooch inlaid with the initials S.L. Samuel Zile. Brannigan raised a hand. "Stay right there." James didn't move. "I wasn't going to run," he said softly. "Not from her." Miss Marple stepped forward. "You've been hiding in plain sight." He looked at her, not frightened, not angry, but tired. "I tried to tell Lucy," he said. "She asked me what I was afraid of. I wanted to say everything. That my name was never really James. That I came here because someone buried a lie and put a stone over it like that would make it disappear." Brannigan's voice was stern. "Your real name?" "Thomas Edwin Cartwright," he said. "Grandson of Edwin Cartwright. Great-grandson of Josephine." "And you came here for what?" Brannigan asked. "Inheritance? Revenge?" He didn't answer right away. Miss Marple broke the silence. "You followed Jonathan Palgrave?" Thomas nodded. "He contacted me 2 months ago. Said he'd found something, letters, a trail. I didn't believe him at first. But then he sent the baptism, records, the register, proof. So I came, took the job here. I wanted to see the Delafords up close, the house my great-grandmother worked in, the people who erased her." "Why not come openly?" Miss Marple asked. "I wanted to know the truth first, before I made a claim, or—" He hesitated. "Before I decided if I even wanted to." Brannigan's tone was sharper now. "You saw Palgrave before he died?" Thomas's face tightened. Yes, but I didn't touch him. I stayed by the elm, just like he told me. He wanted to go in first, speak to someone privately, said he'd call me after. Brannigan narrowed his eyes. And did he? No, Thomas said. He never made it back. Miss Marple stepped closer. You left pipe ash beneath the tree. I waited an hour, he said. Saw the crowd gather, the scream. I left before anyone could ask why I was there. He lowered his gaze. I thought someone had killed him to stop the truth from coming out. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. You're not wrong. Brannigan glanced toward the half-open study door. What's in there? Thomas turned. It used to be locked, but the key was in the top drawer of Celia's writing desk. She left it open yesterday. They entered. The study was immaculate, bare almost. But one detail stood out immediately. A portrait above the desk. A younger Samuel Lyle, sombre in clerical garb, flanked by an unknown woman with dark eyes, and a rigid posture, Josephine Cartwright. Below the portrait a drawer sat open. Inside it, Brannigan found a worn envelope and a small bottle, half empty. He held up the bottle. Digitalis, he muttered. Heart stimulant. In the wrong hands, poison. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the envelope. The handwriting was Celia Delaford's. She read aloud. To be burned unread. Do not open for Horace. But she opened it. Inside was a single letter, unsigned. He cannot be allowed to speak. He's come to break what peace we've kept. My family owes him nothing. The child is not ours to mourn. If he dies, we go on. If not, we unravel. Brannigan exhaled. It was Celia. She poisoned Palgrave. Miss Marple shook her head. Not directly. She never touched him. She didn't need to. Brannigan frowned. Then how? The teacups, Miss Marple said, almost to herself. The ones Alfred Sims carried. One set aside, brought to the gate. Thomas stared at her. I thought I saw him hand something to Palgrave. Miss Marple nodded. A cordial, mixed in the manor kitchen, with a stimulant meant to mimic heat stroke or induce cardiac arrest. Brannigan's face tightened. She used Alfred to deliver it. He never knew. They turned to leave, but at the threshold they found Celia standing there. She wore gloves. Her expression was composed, not a hair out of place. I knew it would come to this, she said softly. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Then you know what must happen. Celia tilted her head. I protected this family. At the cost of a man's life, Brannigan said sharply. And for what? A name etched in stone? Celia didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back and raised her hands. Tell Horace I did it for him, she said. He never knew the truth, and he never could have borne it. Miss Marple watched as the inspector placed Celia under arrest. But her gaze lingered not on the woman being led away, but on Thomas Cartwright. He stood beside the Delaford portrait, hands clenched at his sides. His past was no longer buried, but whether he wanted to claim it, that was still to be seen. Chapter 10. The next morning came with rain, steady, thin, and oddly gentle. It softened the village edges, dulled the hedgerows, and turned the flagstones outside Gossington Manor, slick and gleaming. Miss Marple stood in the breakfast room, alone. The silver teapot had grown cold, untouched beside a folded newspaper. Horace Delaford had not come down, neither had Thomas Cartwright. The manor, once thick with the bustle of gardeners, cooks, and visiting ladies, felt hollow, as if the truth, once dragged into the light, had hollowed out more than a secret. It had unsettled the walls. Brannigan arrived just after 9, soaked to the sleeves and holding a sealed envelope. "She confessed," he said without fanfare. Miss Marple turned from the window. "Celia?" He nodded. "Said she overheard Palgrave's visit to the vicarage weeks ago. Heard him say there was proof of inheritance that could disrupt the Lyle legacy. She knew what that meant. The font, the letter, the names. And she acted." Miss Marple sighed softly. "And yet she never confronted him." "She didn't have to. She waited, used the fate, had Alfred deliver the cordial. She made sure Palgrave would never cross the threshold." "And Horace?" Brannigan lowered his voice. "Still doesn't know. I doubt he ever will. Celia shielded him from everything. Lies, truth, crime. It was all in service of keeping him untouched." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the empty chair across the room. "That's not love," she said quietly. "That's preservation." Brannigan handed her the envelope. "This was addressed to you." She opened it carefully. Inside was a single-page letter. Celia's handwriting. Elegant, fluid, precise. "I know you will understand, Miss Marple. Some families are built on soil so brittle that truth becomes a poison. I thought I was protecting the garden, but I forgot. Some weeds don't die when buried. They wait and bloom." Miss Marple folded the page in silence. The inspector didn't speak until they were both halfway to the churchyard. "I've arranged for Thomas to meet us," he said. "He wanted to see the vault again. Said he didn't want to leave with ghosts still whispering." Miss Marple nodded. "He's right. Truth without peace is just another kind of imprisonment." They reached the iron gate. Rain speckled the old stones, running in slow rivulets across the Delaford name. Thomas stood near the vault, cap in hand, jacket folded over his arm. "I don't know what to do," he said without greeting. "I could file a claim. Horace has no children. The estate could in theory pass to me. There's a solicitor in London who already reached out." "And yet you hesitate," Miss Marple said. Thomas nodded. "Because it wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change what happened to my great-grandmother, or to Jonathan." Brannigan said gently, "So what would you do?" Thomas looked at the vault, at the empty space where a man was meant to rest, but never did. "I thought I came here to take back something stolen," he said. "But maybe all I really wanted was for someone to say it happened, that she mattered, that Josephine Cartwright wasn't a secret worth erasing." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And now she won't be." He turned toward them. "I'm going to write about it. Not for scandal, just a record. For the village library, perhaps. People forget too easily when shame tells them to." Brannigan nodded. "I'll see it entered into the public record, officially." They stood in silence for a moment, the rain falling gently over the grass. Then Miss Marple stepped forward and placed something on the vault stone. The silver button, recovered from the jacket Thomas had left behind. "A reminder," she said, "that history doesn't vanish. It simply waits to be noticed." Thomas smiled faintly. "Thank you." Brannigan turned away first, leaving them to the quiet. When Miss Marple finally followed, the bell of St. Millicent's chimed once through the rain. That evening, the village returned to its routine. Children raced past the baker's cart. The postman lingered longer at the Henshaws. The fade decorations were quietly taken down by the vicar's new assistant. In the parlour of her modest cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea. The fire crackled. Her cat slept on the window-sill. She opened her notebook. A one she kept for her private observations, and wrote, "No murder begins with hatred. It begins with fear. Fear of shame, fear of exposure, fear of being unloved if the truth comes out. But fear lies, and those who listen to it commit acts even they cannot justify later." She closed the notebook, then reached for her knitting. The rain had stopped, and the village, though not healed, had remembered something very old and very important, that even in quiet places truth has a voice, and it will be heard. Chapter 11. 2 days after Celia Delaford's arrest, Horace finally came downstairs. He emerged from his bedroom pale, shoulders slightly stooped, but impeccably dressed in his signature grey waistcoat, and a blue cravat, perhaps out of habit, perhaps in protest of disorder. He took breakfast alone in the dining-room, and then requested to see Miss Marple. She arrived just after 11. Horace stood at the window, holding a photograph in one hand and a pressed linen handkerchief in the other. "She never told me anything," he said, without turning. "Not a word. I knew she managed things, arranged things, but I thought that was a kindness." Miss Marple said nothing. The silence allowed the weight of the room to settle gently between them. "She loved this place more than I ever did," he continued. "It was her idea to maintain the fete, the music evenings, the charities. I simply smiled for the papers." Miss Marple finally spoke. "And now?" He turned. "Now I can't decide if I'm mourning a woman or the illusion of one." She nodded gently. "I wondered," he said after a moment, "if you would come with me to the study." She followed. The study had not been touched since the day of Celia's confession. The desk sat precisely as they'd left it. The drawers closed, the envelope gone. But Horace moved toward the far wall, toward the old grandfather clock that stood silent in its corner. "My father had it installed," he said. "Late Victorian. It chimes only at the hour, but has a hidden compartment here, beneath the face." He reached up and gently lifted the upper panel. A click, soft and hollow. From the space within, he drew out a thin envelope, yellowed and bound with red string. "It was addressed to me," he said, "but Celia must have found it first. I never saw it. Not until the housekeeper brought it yesterday. Found it while dusting." Miss Marple took it delicately. Inside was a letter, dated 23 years earlier. It bore the neat, slanted penmanship of Reverend Edwin Lyle. "Sir Horace, in the event I am no longer able to speak the truth aloud, there are things you must know. I am not the rightful heir to this estate. My name was given to me in protection, not inheritance. My mother, Josephine, died before I was grown, and Samuel Lyle, who raised me, was never legally her husband. this place pass to me by assumption and omission. Not right. You may never need this letter. But if a man ever comes asking questions, listen. The dead cannot reclaim what was lost, but the living might still forgive. Miss Marple handed it back in silence. Horace placed the letter on the mantelpiece. I don't know what I am now, he said quietly. Lord of a house that never truly belonged to me, or just a tired man who didn't ask enough questions. She looked at him with something close to pity, but not condescension. You're a man who has the power to decide what this place becomes, she said, not what it was. He seemed to absorb that. Then, with unexpected resolve, he said, I'd like to speak to Thomas. Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. I think he'd be willing. That afternoon, under a clearing sky, Thomas Cartwright returned to the manor, not as a servant, not as a claimant, but as a guest. He and Horace sat beneath the rose pergola, where the garden still bore signs of the disrupted fate. No tablecloths, no parasols, just the faint scent of damp wood and distant lilac. Miss Marple remained inside, watching from the drawing-room. Brannigan stood beside her. You think it'll go well? He asked. I think it will go truthfully, she replied. That's more important. Outside, Thomas leaned forward. I never wanted the house. Horace shook his head. Then take something more valuable. Take the name if you want it, not for status, for acknowledgement. Thomas looked stunned. You saying? I'm saying I'd rather share the Delaford name with someone honest than guard it like a relic. They sat in quiet for a moment, the kind that needs no reply. Then Horace added softly, You look like her, you know, Josephine. Thomas turned to him, surprised. Horace chuckled dryly. Old photograph. My mother hid it in the sewing chest. Found it once as a boy. Never asked her about it. I regret that. Inside, Miss Marple exhaled. Brannigan nodded toward the doorway. That's it, then. Case closed. Miss Marple didn't respond right away. Then, turning to him, she said, Justice, Inspector, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about placing the last piece where it belongs. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She placed her teacup down, opened her notebook, and wrote one final line. In villages like ours, truth is never lost, only hidden, and the moment someone dares to remember, it flowers. She closed the book, folded her hands, and let the quiet return. But this time, it wasn't an uneasy quiet. It was peace. Chapter 12. The parlour at Miss Marple's cottage was unusually full for a Wednesday afternoon. A modest fire crackled in the hearth. Rain tapped gently at the window panes, and the teacups, 6 of them, rested quietly on their saucers, untouched but steaming. Inspector Brannigan leaned against the mantel, arms folded. Horace Delaford sat near the corner window, looking thinner but oddly younger, as if relief had peeled back 10 years. Lucy Henshaw, clutching a well-worn library book, perched next to her mother, who seemed far less comfortable than her child. And across from Miss Marple, seated squarely and upright, was Thomas Cartwright. Miss Marple took a small sip of tea, then set the cup down. I've invited you all here, she began, because I believe it is better to hear the truth in a quiet room than to read it in a scandalized column or mutter it through fences. Brannigan gave a slight nod. Miss Marple looked at Thomas. You've done something rare, Mr. Cartwright. You've chosen not to inherit what others killed to protect. That deserves clarity, if not applause." Thomas offered a modest smile. She turned then to Lucy. "You were the first to see what no one else did. The torn paper, hidden in the cushion." Lucy looked shy but proud. Miss Marple continued, now addressing the room. "Jonathan Palgrave did not come for money. He came because he was haunted by a name, a missing line in a family tree, a promise made to someone long forgotten." She drew a folded page from her knitting basket and held it gently. "This is a letter found in the clock at Gossington Manor, written by Reverend Edwin Lyle. In it he admits his name and claim were borrowed. The son of a servant girl, and a secret, raised under the Delafoot roof, but never one of them. And when he learned the truth, he did not confront it. He buried it, as they all did." Horace looked down, not in shame, but in acknowledgment. Miss Marple's voice softened. Celia Delaford knew, or at least suspected. When Palgrave arrived with his registers and questions, she saw in him not a man, but a threat. And so she arranged the unthinkable. Brannigan took over gently. A poisoned cordial, disguised as refreshment, handed innocently by Alfred Sims, delivered to a man who never reached the drawing-room. Mrs. Henshaw cleared her throat. "But why the fete? Why not some other time?" Miss Marple smiled thinly. "Because public settings make guilt look accidental. A collapse at a private meeting arouses suspicion. A death during a village gathering, heat stroke, overexertion, a bad heart. It buys time. Time Celia intended to use to destroy the documents and silence the past." Thomas looked at documents and silence the past. Thomas looked up, but she didn't. "Not all of it, no," said Miss Marple, "because secrets kept long enough take root, and when they flower, they do so despite pruning." She turned to Brannigan. "There remains only one thing." He raised a brow. "The clasp." "Precisely." She reached again into her knitting bag and retrieved a small velvet pouch. Brannigan took it, opened it, and revealed a brass clasp, weathered, broken, and engraved faintly with the initials, J.C. Josephine Cartwright. Miss Marple said softly. "It was hidden in the vault cavity, not entirely removed, not burned, just forgotten." Horace's voice was low. "So she was buried, once." Miss Marple nodded, briefly, then moved, perhaps by Edwin, perhaps by Samuel. But the clasp remained, trapped in the vault like a footnote no one could explain. Brannigan pocketed the piece gently. "So," he said, "what do we do with all this?" Miss Marple looked around the room, and the answer was already clear. "You record it," she said, "properly. Not in whispers or myth, but in ink. You allow the village to remember honestly. And then you move forward, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging." Thomas exhaled. "I've already begun. A small memoir, just for the record." Horace glanced over, "And I'll make room in the manor's archives for it, where it belongs." Brannigan chuckled. "That may be the most civil ending to a murder investigation I've ever seen." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Truth is rarely dramatic, Inspector. It's just stubborn, and it prefers quiet company." That evening, as the guests dispersed and the lamps were dimmed, Miss Marple sat once again at her window. Outside, the village settled into its usual rhythm. Horses at pasture, hedgerows trimmed, and the manor windows lit, but no longer hiding. There were no pending questions, no shadows left unexplained, no twisted clue dangling at the edge of comprehension. Celia Delaford awaited trial in London. Jonathan Palgrave had been buried with his name fully restored, and Josephine Cartwright, at last, had a full story behind the simple initials on her clasp. Miss Marple wrote one final line in her notebook before closing it for good. A name is not truth, but it is where truth begins. Chapter 13. A week had passed since the gathering at Miss Marple's parlour, and in that short time the village of St. Giles-on-the-Heath had done what English villages always do: absorbed scandal into rhythm, and turned tragedy into tea-talk. But beneath the surface something gentler stirred, an acceptance of what had long been obscured. The Delafords no longer held their name like a sword, but like a history book. The manor, with its painted ceilings and locked cabinets, now seemed simply human. Miss Marple stepped outside into her small garden just after breakfast. The roses, under careful pruning, had begun to bloom again. Their petals were soft and bright, untouched by secrets. Back from the market, Aunt Jane called Raymond West, her nephew, as he approached through the wicket gate with 2 canvas bags. "Still no one talking about anything but that murder." Miss Marple smiled. "Well, dear, they must talk about something, and at least now they've something worth remembering." Raymond gave her a narrow look. "You're being modest again." She brushed a fallen blossom from her sleeve. "It wasn't difficult, merely a matter of listening to what wasn't said." He set the bags down. "You do know the Gazette is publishing an entire feature on it? The Case of the Delaford Heiress, they're calling it. Quite terrible title. I expect it will sell more copies than you ever managed with your short stories," she said with a wink. Raymond chuckled and took a seat on the garden bench. Just then footsteps sounded beyond the hedge, followed by a polite cough. "May I?" came Horace Delaford's voice from the path. "Of course, Mr. Delaford," said Miss Marple warmly. "Come through." He entered wearing his familiar dark coat, but it no longer swallowed him. There was ease in his step, perhaps even peace. "Just come from the courthouse in Truro," he said. Celia waived the formal hearing. She made a full confession. They'll transport her next month. Raymond stood quietly, watching the older man. "She asked me," Horace added, "to see the family plot arranged properly. For Josephine." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A rare gesture of honesty." "Or guilt," he said. "Perhaps both." Paused, drawing from his pocket a small envelope. "Her locket," he said, handing it to Miss Marple. "Celia had it all these years, locked in her bureau drawer. I thought, perhaps it belongs in gentler hands." Miss Marple opened the envelope and drew out the thin chain, worn with time. The pendant clicked open with a whisper. Inside, a miniature sketch of a child's face, and opposite, a note in faded ink. No name, no title, only love. "I shall ensure it finds its way to the right records," Miss Marple said quietly. Horace nodded and turned to go. "Oh, and Thomas has taken a post in Devon, teaching history, of all things." Miss Marple's eyes lit up. History suits those who understand it. He smiled. Quite. After he left, Raymond looked down at the locket, then back to his aunt. There are some things you'll never tell even me, aren't there? She sipped her tea unbothered. Only the parts that matter less than people think. You see, Raymond, truth is never as grand as the mystery around it. It's simply quieter, but it lingers longer. He leaned back, half charmed, half frustrated. You do love a good dramatic close, he said. Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear, I love a complete one. The story, as the village would recall it, settled into myth with curious grace. The visitor who died with no past, the clasp that told no tale until it did. The heiress who confessed not from pressure but from the weight of inheritance, and the old woman with a teacup and a mind like wire, who solved it all from her window. A week later, the bells of St. Giles rang out on a Sunday morning, as if nothing had happened. But for those who knew, truly knew, there was peace in the air. A mystery had ended, not with spectacle, but with understanding. At the manor gate, freshly painted and no longer locked, Lucy Henshaw placed a bouquet of forget-me-nots beneath the new plaque. In memory of Josephine Cartwright, beloved unknown, now remembered. The end.